I'm Emma Richardson, 36, and for the past 5 years, my family has treated me like their biggest disappointment. At every family gathering, I'm the struggling assistant who never amounted to anything, while my siblings get praised for their corporate jobs and marriages. What they don't know is that I'm actually the CEO of a $50 million tech startup that I built from nothing, working under a carefully crafted alias to protect my company from family drama. Last Thanksgiving, as my mother once again introduced me as our Emma, still trying to figure things out, I made a decision that would change everything. Little did they know that my boss would be joining us for dinner, and the truth I'd been hiding for years was about to explode their perfect little narrative. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should support you most, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next will shock you. Growing up as the middle child in the Richardson family meant living in the shadows of my older brother Michael and younger sister Sarah. Michael, now 32, had been the golden boy since he could walk. Star athlete, valedictorian, full scholarship to Harvard, and now a successful investment banker pulling in $300K annually. Sarah, 26, followed closely behind as the family princess, beauty queen, law school graduate, corporate lawyer at a prestigious firm, married to another lawyer, living in their perfect suburban dream house. Then there was me, Emma, the creative one, the dreamer, the one who marched to her own beat, all euphemisms my parents used instead of saying what they really thought, that I was the disappointment. I still remember my college graduation day, clutching that computer science degree I'd worked so hard for. While my classmates celebrated their achievements, I watched my parents beam with pride at Michael's latest promotion announcement that same week. My graduation program sat forgotten on the kitchen counter, while Michael's business card was proudly displayed on the refrigerator next to Sarah's law school acceptance letter. Emma's always been different, my mother would tell relatives, her voice carrying that particular tone of resigned disappointment. She dropped out of her master's program well, we're not entirely sure what she's doing now, something with computers. The truth was, I'd left my master's program because I'd identified a gap in the market for small business automation software. While my professors droned on about theoretical frameworks, I was building real solutions for real problems. I'd already landed 3 clients and was generating revenue. But try explaining that to parents who equated success with traditional corporate ladders and impressive job titles. Michael would visit for holidays in his designer suits, talking about his latest deals and investment portfolios. Sarah would arrive with her lawyer husband, discussing their recent house purchase and vacation plans to Europe. And I'd sit there in my jeans and simple sweater, listening to them compare salaries and benefits packages while I quietly built a business that would eventually dwarf all their accomplishments combined. The family hierarchy was established early and reinforced constantly. Michael got the financial support for his MBA, Sarah received help with law school expenses, and when I asked for a small loan to expand my business, I was told that hobbies shouldn't be subsidized. My childhood bedroom walls were covered with certificates and awards, but they were always overshadowed by my siblings' more legitimate achievements. My first-place finish in the state coding competition was less impressive than Michael's football trophies. My acceptance into the Honor Society paled next to Sarah's beauty pageant crowns. What hurt most wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the active dismissal. When I tried to explain my business ideas over dinner, eyes would glaze over. When I mentioned landing a new client, the conversation would quickly shift to Michael's latest vacation or Sarah's recent case victory. I learned to stop sharing, to keep my world separate from theirs. They had no idea that their failing daughter was building an empire. The decision to create a professional alias wasn't born from shame. It was born from necessity. After years of family dismissal and potential clients discovering my age and background, I realized that Emma Richardson, college dropout from suburban Connecticut, carried too much baggage. So I became E.R. Matthews, a mysterious and successful entrepreneur whose personal life remained carefully private. The transformation began with my business registration documents. Nextech Solutions was officially incorporated with E.R. Matthews as CEO and founder. I created a professional persona complete with a sophisticated website, carefully crafted bio, and strategic ambiguity about my background. To the business world, I was a seasoned professional who'd identified crucial gaps in small business automation. My tiny studio apartment became the headquarters of my secret empire. I'd transformed the living room into a workspace, with multiple monitors, whiteboards covered in flowcharts, and a corner dedicated to client calls where I'd positioned my bookshelf as a professional backdrop. The bedroom served as my warehouse, storing the few physical products we shipped. The kitchen table doubled as my conference room for video meetings. While my family assumed I was struggling to pay rent, I was actually reinvesting every dollar back into the business. My lifestyle remained modest by choice, not necessity. I drove a reliable used car, shopped at discount stores, and lived frugally. Not because I had to, but because every saved dollar could be pumped into research and development. The breakthrough came 18 months after incorporation. TechFlow Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company, was hemorrhaging money due to inefficient inventory management. Their existing software was outdated, clunky, and required manual oversight that cost them thousands in labor hours monthly. I pitched them a custom automation solution that would integrate with their existing systems while providing real-time analytics and predictive ordering. The contract was worth $150,000 initially, with ongoing monthly fees of $8,000. But more. Importantly, it proved my concept worked. TechFlow's efficiency improved by 40% within 6 months, and their cost savings exceeded $300,000 annually. Word spread quickly in their industry network. Within a year, I had 12 major clients, each paying between $5,000 and $15,000 monthly for my software solutions. My revenue hit $1.2 million in year 2, and I was finally able to hire my first employee, David Chen, a brilliant programmer who'd been laid off from a major tech firm. David became my COO, and together we refined our systems and expanded our IA client base. By year 3, we had 37 clients across multiple industries. I'd moved the business to a proper office space but maintained my modest lifestyle. My family still thought I was a struggling assistant, because that's what I let them believe. Every family gathering, I'd wear my oldest clothes, drive my reliable but unimpressive car, and speak vaguely about working in tech support. The irony was delicious. While Michael bragged about his 6-figure salary, I was quietly building a business that generated more revenue in a month than he made all year. While Sarah celebrated her partnership track, I owned 100% of a company valued at over $50 million. The success was intoxicating, but the secrecy was exhausting. I wanted to share my victories, to finally show my family that their failure had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But I also knew that revealing the truth would invite scrutiny, interference, and potentially damage the professional reputation I'd worked so hard to build. Every business award, every industry recognition, every major contract win, I celebrated. Alone or with David, my family remained blissfully unaware that E.R. Matthews, the mysterious CEO they'd never heard of, was their own allegedly unsuccessful Emma. The Richardson family Thanksgiving had become as predictable as clockwork, and just as mechanical in its precision. Every November, we'd gather at my parents' colonial house in West Hartford, where Mom would spend weeks preparing the perfect meal and Dad would polish his collection of family stories for the extended relatives who'd join us. The ritual began the moment I walked through the front door. "Emma's here," Mom would announce, followed immediately by, "She's still working as an assistant, but she's figuring things out." The pause before figuring things out grew longer each year, weighted with disappointment and barely concealed embarrassment. This year's family newsletter, printed on cream-colored cardstock with our family photo from last Christmas, sat prominently on the coffee table. I'd received my copy weeks ago, but hadn't had the heart to read it closely. The Richardson family annual update always followed the same format: Dad's golf achievements, Mom's volunteer work, Michael's latest promotion, Sarah's career milestones, and travel adventures. My section, buried on page 3, read simply, "Emma continues to work in the technology sector and is still finding her path in life." Still finding her path. At 29, while running a $50 million company. The extended family would arrive around noon, Aunt Patricia with her judgmental comments disguised as concern, Uncle Robert with his unsolicited career advice, and various cousins who'd achieved conventional markers of success and weren't shy about sharing them. They'd all gather in the living room, drinks in hand, comparing achievements like trading cards. Michael just bought his second property, Mom would announce proudly. An investment condo in Boston. He's so smart with money. And Sarah made partner track, Dad would add. Youngest in her firm's history. We're so proud. Then all eyes would turn to me, sitting in the corner chair that had somehow become designated as my spot. Close enough to be included, far enough, away to be easily ignored. Emma's still in tech support, someone would eventually say, followed by that familiar pause and pitying looks. I'd learned to perfect my response over the years. Yes, still working with computers. It's challenging, but rewarding. Vague enough to avoid questions, specific enough to sound legitimate. No one ever asked for details because they'd already decided my work wasn't worth understanding. The worst part wasn't the dismissal, it was the advice. Uncle Robert, who'd worked the same insurance job for 30 years, would corner me after dinner with suggestions about finding a real career. Aunt Patricia would slip me business cards of her friends' children who'd made something of themselves in traditional corporate roles. Even the younger cousins, fresh out of college with entry-level positions, would offer to put in a good word for me at their companies. I'd smile and nod, thanking them for their concern while internally calculating that my company's monthly profit exceeded their annual salaries. I'd listen to lectures about stability and benefits while knowing I could retire comfortably tomorrow if I chose to. I'd accept their pity while sitting on a fortune they couldn't imagine. Last year, Cousin Jennifer had patted my hand sympathetically after learning I was still single and still job searching. She'd just gotten engaged to an accountant and seemed to view my life as a cautionary tale. Don't worry, Emma, she'd said with genuine kindness. Your time will come. You just need to focus and maybe consider more traditional paths. Traditional paths. As if innovation and entrepreneurship were somehow less valid than following predetermined scripts. The annual newsletter perfectly captured the family's perception of success. Measurable, conventional, socially acceptable achievements that could be easily explained to strangers at cocktail parties. My empire remained invisible because it didn't fit their definition of accomplishment. The final straw came 3 weeks before this year's Thanksgiving, buried in our family group chat like a digital dagger to the heart. I'd made the mistake of mentioning that I was considering expanding my business operations, carefully phrasing it as exploring new opportunities in my field. Michael's response was swift and cutting. Emma's got another one of her big ideas. Sarah chimed in. Remember her last business opportunity? Mom and Dad, please don't let her hit you up for money again. Dad's reply stung the most. We've learned our lesson about funding Emma's schemes. Schemes. 5 years of building a legitimate, profitable business, and they still called it schemes. Mom tried to soften the blow with her trademark passive aggression. We just want Emma to find something stable. All this entrepreneurship talk makes us nervous. I stared at my phone screen, reading and rereading the thread. These were the same people who'd celebrated when Michael's investment firm had a good quarter, who'd thrown a party when Sarah's law firm landed a major client. But my actual, measurable, documented success was dismissed as delusion. The irony was that I hadn't asked them for money in over 4 years. The last time had been a modest $5,000 loan to upgrade my equipment. Money I'd repaid within 3 months with interest. Yet they still referenced it like I was some chronic financial burden instead of someone who'd built something extraordinary from nothing. That night, I sat in my real office. Not the cramped apartment setup they imagined, surrounded by awards they'd never seen, looking at financial statements they couldn't comprehend. My company's quarterly report showed revenue growth of 340% year over year. We'd just signed our largest client ever, a Fortune 500 company that would pay us $2.3 million annually for our services. I had 17 employees who depended on me for their livelihoods and dozens of clients who trusted me with their business operations. Yet my own family saw me as a failure. I pulled up the family group chat again, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could end this right now. One screenshot of my bank statement, one photo of my CEO business cards, one link to the Forbes article that had featured me as an industry innovator. I could shut down their condescension permanently, But I didn't. Instead, I made a different decision. I was going to tell them in person at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone. The plan began forming in my mind as I paced around my office. I wouldn't just reveal the truth. I'd orchestrate it perfectly. I'd let them perform their annual ritual of dismissal, let them pat my head and offer their unwanted advice, let them position me as the family cautionary tale one more time, and then I'd show them exactly who Emma Richardson really was. I called David the next morning. "I need a favor," I said. "How would you feel about joining my family for Thanksgiving dinner?" "That sounds wonderful," he replied. "But why do I sense there's more to this invitation?" I explained the situation, the years of dismissal, the family's perception of my life versus reality. David listened quietly, occasionally making sounds of disbelief. "So you want me to accidentally reveal that you're my CEO?" he asked when I finished. "Not accidentally, strategically. They need to hear it from someone else, someone they can't dismiss as delusional or lying." David was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. "Emma, this is either the most brilliant thing you've ever planned or the most potentially explosive family dinner in history." "Maybe both," I admitted. "But I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being treated like a failure when I've succeeded beyond any of their wildest dreams. I want them to see me, really see me, for who I am." "All right," David said. "I'm in. But we need to plan this carefully. One wrong move and it could backfire spectacularly." We spent the next 2 weeks strategizing. David would arrive as my business partner, visiting from out of town. He'd be charming, professional, and gradually drop hints about our company's success. The revelation would come naturally, ideally in response to their inevitable questions about my career prospects. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. I wouldn't have to defend myself or prove anything. David would simply tell the truth about who I was and what I'd accomplished. The shock would speak for itself. Creating the perfect invitation required more thought than I'd initially realized. It couldn't be too formal. That would raise suspicions. It couldn't be too casual. That might diminish David's credibility. It needed to strike exactly the right tone of pleasant surprise mixed with business convenience. I spent an entire evening crafting the perfect message to my mother. "Hi, Mom. I hope it's okay, but I'd like to bring someone to Thanksgiving dinner this year. David Chen is my business partner who's visiting from California, and he doesn't have anywhere to go for the holiday. He's incredibly polite and offered to bring wine. Would that be all right?" The response came within minutes. "Of course, honey. We'd love to meet your friend. How exciting that you have a business partner. Maybe this venture will finally work out for you." Even in her acceptance, Mom couldn't resist the subtle dig. Finally work out implied that all my previous efforts had been failures, that this was just another in a long line of desperate attempts at success. If only she knew that David and I had already worked out to the tune of $50 million, I forwarded the exchange to David, who replied with a simple, "Game on." Over the next few days, I briefed David on my family dynamics. He needed to understand the players, their personalities, and their established patterns of interaction. Michael was the golden boy who dominated conversations with tales of financial conquest. Sarah was the princess who expected admiration for her conventional achievements. My parents were well-meaning, but had clearly written me off as the family disappointment. "The key," I explained during one of our planning sessions, "is that they need to discover the truth organically. If it feels staged or rehearsed, they'll dismiss it as elaborate fiction." David nodded thoughtfully. "So I should just be myself, your COO who respects and admires your leadership, and let them draw their own conclusions." "Exactly. Answer their questions honestly. If they ask about our business, tell them about our success. If they ask about your role, explain that you work for me. The revelation will build naturally." We also discussed logistics. David would arrive separately, giving me time to endure the initial round of family condescension alone. This would establish the baseline dynamic, me as the struggling underachiever, before introducing the element that would shatter their preconceptions. The formal invitation I created was deliberately elegant, printed on quality cardstock with professional formatting. It read, "The Richardson family cordially invites David Chen to join them for Thanksgiving dinner. Please come prepared to share what you're grateful for this year. I hand-delivered it to David at the office, where several employees saw the exchange. To them, it looked like a thoughtful gesture from a CEO who cared about her team's personal lives. They had no idea they were witnessing the setup for the most dramatic family dinner in Richardson history. "Are you nervous?" David asked as he examined the invitation. I considered the question carefully. "Excited," I finally answered. I've been hiding who I am for so long that I'd forgotten what it feels like to imagine being fully seen by my family. And if they react badly? I'd thought about this possibility extensively. Then at least I'll know where I stand. Right now, they love a version of me that doesn't exist. The struggling daughter who needs their guidance and pity. I'd rather they reject the real me than continue loving a fiction. David smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. Most people would just keep hiding rather than risk this kind of confrontation." That evening, I stood in my apartment, my real apartment, the spacious 2-bedroom in downtown Hartford that I'd furnished with the fruits of my success, and looked at the family photo on my mantel. It was from last Christmas, all of us gathered around the tree, everyone smiling for the camera. I was positioned slightly apart from the group, as always, my smile not quite reaching my eyes. Next year's photo would be different. Either I'd be standing proudly as their successful daughter, finally recognized for who I truly was, or I wouldn't be in it at all. Both possibilities seemed preferable to another year of invisible achievement. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the crisp November air that always made me nostalgic for childhood holidays, back when I still believed my family's love was unconditional. I woke up early in my downtown apartment, far from the modest studio they imagined I lived in, and reviewed the financial portfolio summary that David and I had prepared as potential evidence. The document was devastating in its simplicity. Nextech. Solutions. Current valuation, $52.3 million. Annual revenue, $18.7 million. Personal net worth, $34.8 million. Employee count, 23. Major clients, 47, including 3 Fortune 500 companies. It was a single page that would obliterate 5 years of family assumptions. I dressed carefully in my poor, struggling Emma costume, a simple sweater from Target, jeans I'd owned since college, and the worn boots that had become my signature at family gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was dressing down to hide success, while my siblings probably spent hours perfecting their successful professional looks. The drive to West Hartford felt longer than usual, each mile bringing me closer to a conversation that would fundamentally alter our family dynamic. I'd rehearsed various scenarios in my mind, but the unknown variables made me nervous. How would Mom react when she realized her disappointing daughter was actually the most successful person in the family? Would Dad's dismissive attitude transform into pride or resentment? I arrived at the colonial house I'd grown up in. Its white exterior and black shutters exactly as they'd been throughout my childhood. The familiar sight of cars already in the driveway told me the extended family had begun arriving. Uncle Robert's sedan, Aunt Patricia's SUV, Cousin Jennifer's compact car, all the usual suspects were gathering for another year of the Richardson family performance. Mom greeted me at the door with her traditional mixture of affection and subtle disappointment. "Emma, you're early. How nice that you're bringing someone this year. It's been so long since you've dated anyone seriously." "David isn't. We're not dating, Mom. He's my business partner." "Oh," her face fell slightly. "Well, that's nice too, I suppose. Maybe he can give you some career guidance." The irony was already thick enough to cut with a knife, and David hadn't even arrived yet. I wandered into the kitchen where the familiar Thanksgiving chaos was unfolding. Mom orchestrated the meal preparation with military precision, while Dad polished silverware and arranged furniture. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing, exactly as it had every November of my life. "Emma, could you help set the table?" Mom asked, without looking up from the gravy she was stirring. "We'll need one extra place setting for your friend." As I arranged plates and napkins, I couldn't help but think about the boardroom where I'd hosted client dinners worth more than most people's annual salaries. My hands, which signed contracts and approved budgets that affected dozens of lives, were setting a table where I'd be treated like an unemployed child. Michael arrived with his usual fanfare, immediately launching into stories about his latest investment victories. "The market's been incredible this quarter," he announced to anyone within earshot. "I've generated over 40% returns for my clients." Sarah followed shortly after with her lawyer husband, both of them glowing with the satisfaction of people who'd achieved everything society told them to want. They discussed their recent home renovation and upcoming vacation to Italy, their voices carrying the casual confidence of the financially secure. I listened to their conversations while folding napkins, calculating in my head that my company's profit margin last month exceeded their combined annual salaries. The temptation to interrupt with a casual mention of my own success was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stick to the plan. "Emma's bringing someone today," Mom announced to the gathering family. "A business partner." "Business partner?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What kind of business are you in now, Em?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. I could see the familiar skepticism in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn when I'd tried to explain my various entrepreneurial ventures over the years. To him, my businesses were hobbies at best, delusions at worst. "Technology consulting?" I replied vaguely, the same answer I'd given for years. "Still doing tech support?" Uncle Robert called from the living room. "Good for you, staying consistent. Tech support." If they only knew that my tech support involved architecting enterprise solutions for companies they'd recognize from their investment portfolios. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, David's punctuality as reliable as everything else about him. Mom rushed to answer it, and I heard her bright, welcoming voice greeting my COO as if he were just another dinner guest instead of the person who was about to detonate their understanding of reality. "You must be David. Emma's told us so much about you." I hadn't told them anything about him, but Mom's automatic hostess mode had kicked in. I took a deep breath and prepared for the most important performance of my life, the performance where I would finally stop performing and start being myself. David entered the Richardson family ecosystem like a perfectly calibrated disruption. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that managed to look both professional and appropriately festive, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my family spent on groceries in a week. His presence immediately elevated the room's energy in a way that made everyone unconsciously straighten their posture. "Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, thank you so much for including me in your family celebration," he said, presenting the wine to my mother with a slight bow that was formal without being pretentious. "Emma speaks of you often." Mom practically glowed under his polished attention. I watched her process his appearance, the expensive suit, the confident demeanor, the articulate speech, and saw her mental gears turning. This wasn't what she'd expected from someone associated with her struggling daughter. "Please, call us Janet and Robert," Dad said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Any friend of Emma's is welcome here." "What line of work are you in, David?" "I'm in technology solutions," David replied smoothly. "Emma and I work together." The phrase was technically accurate while being completely misleading. They heard "work together" and assumed we were colleagues at some company. They had no framework for understanding that working together meant he reported directly to me as CEO. Michael stepped forward with his usual alpha male posturing, sizing up this unexpected addition to our gathering. "Technology solutions, that's pretty broad. What kind of clients do you work with?" "Primarily mid to large enterprise clients who need custom automation systems," David answered. "Manufacturing, logistics, financial services. Companies that have outgrown their current software capabilities and need something more sophisticated." I watched my brother's expression shift slightly. This wasn't the vague computer stuff he was used to hearing about my work. David was speaking. His language, business language, client language, money language. Sarah joined the conversation with her lawyer's instinct for gathering information. "That sounds lucrative. The automation sector has been growing exponentially." "It has," David agreed. "We've been fortunate to be positioned well in a rapidly expanding market." The word "we" hung beautifully in the air. To my family, it suggested partnership, collaboration, equal footing. They couldn't conceive that in our "we," I was the CEO and David was my employee. Aunt Patricia, never one to miss an opportunity for interrogation, swooped in with her trademark nosiness. "How did you and Emma meet? Are you from Connecticut originally?" "I'm originally from California," David said. "Emma recruited me about 3 years ago when she was expanding her operations. Best career move I ever made." The beauty of his response was its complete honesty. I had recruited him. I was expanding operations. It was the best career move he'd ever made, but framed within their assumptions about my life, they heard a completely different story. Emma recruited you? Mom's voice carried a note of confused pride. Our Emma? Your Emma is quite remarkable, David said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. She has an incredible ability to see solutions where others see problems. Her strategic thinking is exceptional. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, partly from embarrassment at the unexpected praise, partly from the surreal experience of hearing my professional qualities acknowledged in my childhood home. Dad looked at me with something approaching surprise. Well, that's wonderful to hear. Emma's always been creative. Creative, the family euphemism for impractical. But David's presence was already shifting their perception. His obvious respect for me was forcing them to reconsider their assumptions. She's much more than creative, David said. She's visionary. The way she identified market gaps that other people missed, it's been incredible to watch. Michael's competitive instincts kicked in. What kind of market gaps? Small and medium. Businesses were drowning in inefficient systems, David explained. They knew they needed automation, but couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. Emma created scalable platforms that bridged that gap perfectly. I watched my family processing this information. They were hearing about business strategy, market analysis, scalable platforms, concepts that contradicted everything they believed about my capabilities. That sounds quite sophisticated, Sarah said slowly. What's your role in all this, David? Here it came. The moment of truth was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. David glanced at me briefly, a silent question in his eyes. I gave him the smallest nod. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, he said simply. Emma handles the strategic vision and client relationships. I manage day-to-day operations and implementation. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of confusion across the room. Co meant he was in an executive position, but if he was the COO, and they worked together, then what was I? Mom looked back and forth between us, her hostess smile wavering as she tried to process the implications. So you're both executives at this company? Well, David said with a slight smile, Emma's the boss. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 23 pairs of eyes, family members, who'd been gradually gathering around our conversation, stared at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. Emma's the boss. 4 simple words that shattered 5 years of carefully maintained fiction. The dinner table conversation proceeded exactly as it had for the past 5 years, but now with an undercurrent of confusion that my family couldn't quite articulate. David's presence had introduced a dissonance they couldn't resolve. Their failing daughter apparently commanded the respect of an obviously successful executive, but they couldn't make sense of the contradiction. Michael launched into his traditional Thanksgiving monologue about market performance and client acquisitions. This year has been exceptional for our division, he announced, cutting his turkey with theatrical precision. We've increased our assets under management by 32%, which translates to roughly $15 million in new capital. I mentally calculated that my company's revenue growth had been 340% this year, but I kept my expression appropriately impressed by my brother's achievements. The family responded with their usual chorus of admiration and follow-up questions about his success. Strategies. Michael's always been brilliant with investments, Mom said proudly. Even as a child, he understood money better than most adults. Sarah picked up the torch seamlessly. Speaking of success stories, Thomas and I just closed on our vacation. Property in the Hamptons. We've been looking for the right investment opportunity for months. She described the beachfront cottage they'd purchased, the renovation plans, the projected rental income during peak season. The family listened with rapt attention, asking about square footage and mortgage rates and property taxes. Real estate. It's so smart, Aunt Patricia declared. Tangible assets, steady appreciation, much more reliable than all these technology fads. I nearly choked on my wine. Technology fads. If only she knew that my technology fad had generated more wealth in 5 years than their combined real estate portfolios would appreciate in decades. David maintained perfect composure throughout the presentations, occasionally nodding politely, but never interjecting with competitive stories of his own success. His restraint was masterful. He was letting my family perform their annual ritual of achievement comparison without challenging their established hierarchy. Uncle Robert, emboldened by wine and the captive audience, launched into his philosophical observations about success and responsibility. The key to building wealth, he pronounced, is consistency and traditional investment strategies. All these young people today, chasing get-rich-quick schemes with their apps and startups, it's unsustainable. Get-rich-quick schemes. I glanced at David, who was studying his plate with suspicious intensity. My get-rich-quick scheme employed 23 people and had been featured in 3 business publications this year. Emma knows all about that, Dad said, with a chuckle that wasn't entirely kind. She's tried her hand at various entrepreneurial ventures over the years. The phrase "tried her hand" made it sound like I'd dabbled in hobbies rather than built a legitimate business empire. I felt David tense beside me, his professional instincts clearly warring with social politeness. The technology sector can be volatile, Michael added helpfully. It's why I always recommend diversified portfolios to my clients. Too much risk in any single industry, especially something as unpredictable as tech. I owned stock in 17 different companies across 8 industries, including a portfolio that had outperformed the S&P 500 by 46% over the past 3 years. But my family had decided I was financially illiterate, so they continued, offering investment advice as if I were a child with a piggy bank. Cousin Jennifer, newly engaged and glowing with conventional happiness, directed her attention to David with the kind of aggressive friendliness that made me nervous. So David, what's your take on Emma's business ventures? Do you think she's finally found something stable? The question was loaded with assumptions, that my previous efforts had been failures, that stability was something I'd been lacking, that David's opinion carried more weight than my actual results. David set down his fork and looked directly at Jennifer. I think Emma has built something extraordinary. Her instincts for market opportunities are exceptional, and her execution has been flawless. The compliment hung in the air like a foreign language. No one in my family had ever described my work as extraordinary or flawless. They'd used words like interesting, ambitious, and hopeful, but never anything suggesting actual success. That's very kind of you to say, Mom said diplomatically. We've always supported Emma's creativity, even when her projects haven't worked out as planned. Projects that hadn't worked out. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. My failed projects had generated millions in revenue and changed the operational efficiency of dozens of companies. What projects didn't work out? David asked innocently. The question created an uncomfortable pause. My family realized they couldn't actually name specific failures because they'd never paid enough attention to know what I was doing. Their assumption of failure was based on my modest lifestyle and their own preconceptions, not actual evidence. Well, Dad said slowly, Emma's always been more of a dreamer than a practical businesswoman. I watched David's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He'd seen me negotiate million-dollar contracts, manage complex client relationships, and make strategic decisions that affected dozens of employees' livelihoods. The word dreamer must have sounded absurd to someone who knew my actual capabilities. In my experience, David said carefully, Emma is extremely practical. Her business strategies are grounded in solid market research and realistic projections. Another pause. They were hearing descriptions of professional competence that didn't align with their mental image of me as the family disappointment. The conversation was heading toward a precipice, and everyone could sense it. The extended family's interrogation began in earnest after dinner, fueled by wine and the mysterious contradictions surrounding David's presence. They'd gathered in the living room with coffee and dessert, arranging themselves in the familiar semicircle that had witnessed countless family discussions over the years. Aunt Patricia, emboldened by her third glass of wine, took the lead with her trademark blend of concern and nosiness. David, you seem like such an accomplished young man. I'm curious how you ended up working with Emma in, what was it? Technology support? Technology solutions, David corrected gently. And I wouldn't say I ended up working with Emma. I actively sought out the opportunity. This response clearly puzzled them. Why would a successful professional actively seek to work with their underachieving Emma? Uncle Robert leaned forward with his traditional dispensing wisdom posture. Son, I've been in business for 35 years, And I've learned that partnership ventures can be tricky. You want to make sure you're aligned with people who have realistic expectations and proven track records. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was warning David about me, suggesting I might be an unreliable business partner who would drag down his success. Emma's track record speaks for itself, David replied smoothly. She's built something remarkable from the ground up. Built what, exactly? Michael interjected with his lawyer-like precision. I mean, we're all family here. What specific business are we talking about? The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating had arrived. The direct questions that would require specific answers. I felt my heart rate accelerate as David glanced at me briefly before responding. Nextech Solutions, he said. Custom automation software for mid-market and enterprise clients. I watched my family process this information. The name sounded legitimate, professional, substantial, not like the vague consulting work they'd imagined I was doing. How many employees? Sarah asked, with her attorney's instinct for gathering facts. 23 full-time, plus contractors as needed, David answered. 23 employees. I could see them recalculating their assumptions about the scope of my work. This wasn't a one-person operation running out of a spare bedroom. And revenue? Michael pressed, his competitive instincts fully engaged. David paused, looking at me. Again, we'd discussed this moment extensively. The point where vague answers would no longer suffice. I gave him a small nod. Annual revenue is just over 18 million, he said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the number sink in, watched them mentally compare it to their own financial situations. Michael's investment division managed more money than that, but his personal income was a fraction of my company's revenue. Sarah's law firm was successful, but she was a junior partner earning a salary, not an owner generating millions. Cousin Jennifer was the first to speak. 18 million? That's a substantial business. It is, David agreed. Emma's been incredibly successful. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Emma, why didn't you tell us your business was doing so well? It was a fair question, with a complicated answer. How could I explain that I'd tried to share my success over the years, only to have it dismissed or minimized? How could I tell them that their own attitudes had forced me to hide my achievements? I've mentioned the business many times, I said carefully. I don't think anyone was particularly interested in the details. Mom looked genuinely confused. But you always seemed so modest about it. We thought it was just a small consulting practice. I am modest about it, I replied. Success doesn't require constant bragging. The subtle dig landed exactly as intended. My family's annual tradition of achievement comparison suddenly seemed gauche and insecure compared to my quiet competence. Uncle Robert, clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with his established opinion of me, tried a different approach. Well, revenue is one thing, but what about profit margins? Expenses? A lot of these tech companies have high revenue, but no actual profitability. It was a reasonable business question, but his tone suggested he was still looking for evidence, that my success was somehow illusory. David's smile was razor sharp. Profit margins are excellent. Emma runs a very efficient operation. But surely there are investors, partners, parent companies, Aunt Patricia pressed. These kinds of numbers usually involve multiple stakeholders. No, David said simply. Emma owns 100% of the company. She built it entirely with her own capital and sweat equity. 100% ownership, the final revelation that shattered their assumptions completely. I wasn't just successful. I was independently, dramatically, undeniably successful. Without partners, without investors, without anyone else's money or connections. The woman they'd been treating as the family failure was actually the most successful person in the room. The phone call that changed everything came at 8:47 p.m., just as we were settling into the post-dinner lull that traditionally marked the evening's transition from formal celebration to casual family time. David's phone buzzed against the coffee table where he'd placed it, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. "I'm so sorry," he said, glancing at the caller ID. "This is one of our major clients. I should probably take this before anyone could respond." He'd answered with his professional voice. "David Chen speaking." I watched my family's faces as they listened to one side of what was clearly a business conversation. David's tone was confident, authoritative, clearly someone accustomed to handling important matters. Yes, I understand the urgency, he was saying. Let me check with my CEO about adjusting the timeline. My CEO. The words hung in the air like a revelation waiting to detonate. David placed his hand over the phone's microphone and looked directly at me. Emma, it's Richardson Manufacturing. They want to accelerate the implementation schedule for the new system. Can we move the January launch to December 15th? The question was purely professional, the kind of strategic decision I made daily. But framed within my family's presence, it carried explosive implications. David wasn't asking for my opinion or advice. He was asking for my authorization as his superior. I considered the logistics quickly. We'll need to bring in 2 additional contractors and extend the testing phase by a week, but it's doable. The revenue acceleration would be worth the extra costs. Perfect, David said, then returned to his call. We can accommodate that timeline. Yes, my CEO has approved the accelerated schedule. We'll have the revised proposal to you by Monday morning. He ended the call and placed the phone back on the table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room's atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The casual conversation had stopped completely, replaced by a charged silence as my family processed what they'd just witnessed. Mom spoke first, her voice uncertain. Your CEO? Yes, David replied simply. Emma. The word dropped into the silence, like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled family. I watched their faces as they struggled to reconcile this new information with 5 years of assumptions about my life and capabilities. Emma is your CEO? Dad repeated slowly, as if saying it aloud might help him understand it better. She's the founder and chief executive officer of Nextech Solutions, David confirmed. Has been since day one. I'm honored to work for her. Michael leaned forward, his competitive instincts fully engaged. Wait, let me understand this. Emma owns a company that generates $18 million in annual revenue, employs 23 people, and you work for her? That's correct. Sarah's legal training kicked in, demanding precise clarification. When you said you worked together, you meant she's your boss? I meant I'm extremely fortunate to work for one of the most innovative entrepreneurs I've ever encountered, David said with genuine warmth. Emma recruited me from a Fortune 500 company because she needed someone with my operational experience to help scale her vision. Uncle Robert looked like he was watching a magic trick he couldn't figure out. But Emma's always worked in tech support, administrative work. No, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelation began. I've never worked in tech support. I've always been building and running my own company. The admission felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. 5 years of careful misdirection, of allowing them to believe what they wanted to believe, had just crumbled in a single moment. But your lifestyle, Aunt Patricia protested. Your apartment, your car, My modest choices, I interrupted. I live below my means because I prefer investing in my business and my employees rather than impressing people with expensive possessions. The irony was delicious. They'd interpreted my financial responsibility as evidence of failure, when it was actually evidence of success. While they leveraged themselves for status symbols, I'd been building genuine wealth. Cousin Jennifer stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're a CEO? An actual CEO? She's not just any CEO, David interjected. Emma's company has been featured in 3 major business publications this year. She's considered a rising star in the automation sector. He pulled out his phone and after a few swipes turned the screen toward the group. It showed a Forbes article with my professional headshot. Not Emma Richardson, the family disappointment, but E.R. Matthews, the innovative entrepreneur. The photograph was striking. I was wearing a tailored black suit, my hair styled professionally, my expression confident and commanding. I looked like exactly what I was, a successful business executive. But to my family, who'd only ever seen me in casual clothes playing the role of the struggling daughter, the image was revolutionary. That's you, Mom whispered, studying the photo with wonder and confusion. That's me, I confirmed. Dad reached for David's phone, examining the article more closely. Industry innovator, game-changing solutions, projected 100 million valuation. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Emma, this says your company is worth 52 million, as of the last independent valuation. I said simply. The number hit them like a physical blow. My company was worth more than all their assets combined. The daughter they'd been pitying and patronizing was actually wealthier than they could imagine. Michael's competitive facade finally cracked. You're worth $52 million? The company is. My personal net worth is about $35 million. $35 million. I watched the numbers sink in, watched them realize that their failure daughter had achieved a level of success that dwarfed their own accomplishments. The family hierarchy that had defined our relationships for decades had just completely inverted. The initial shock manifested differently across my family members, like watching a slow-motion explosion ripple through the room. Mom's hand went to her throat in a gesture of unconscious distress, while Dad sat back, heavily in his chair, as if the revelation had physical weight. Michael's face cycled through disbelief, calculation, and something that might have been envy. This has to be some kind of mistake, Aunt Patricia announced with the authority of someone accustomed to being the family's voice of reason. Emma. Honey, I think there might be some confusion about the numbers. Maybe David's company is worth that much, and there's been a misunderstanding about your role. It was a lifeline thrown to preserve their worldview, a way to explain away the impossible, without confronting their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. I watched David's expression tighten with professional offense. There's no misunderstanding, he said firmly. Emma founded Next Tech Solutions 5 years ago. She developed the core technology, secured the initial clients, and built the company from nothing. I joined as an employee 3 years ago, when she needed operational expertise to manage rapid growth. Sarah's legal training kicked in with cross-examination intensity. But if Emma's been running a multi-million-dollar company, why has she been living like... She paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. Like someone struggling financially? The question exposed the core of their confusion. Success in their world had visible markers. Expensive cars, designer clothes, luxury vacations, prominent addresses. My modest lifestyle had been their primary evidence of failure. Because I'm not insecure about my achievements, I said quietly. I don't need external validation through conspicuous consumption. The subtle criticism landed like a precision strike. Their annual tradition of comparing purchases and salaries suddenly seemed shallow and performative compared to my quiet confidence. Uncle Robert, clearly struggling to maintain his position, as family patriarch and business advisor, attempted to regain control of the narrative. Even if these numbers are accurate, Emma, building a successful business requires more than just revenue. What about sustainability, market position, competition? It was condescending mansplaining disguised as legitimate business inquiry. He was still trying to find evidence that my success was somehow flawed or temporary. David's response was ice cold. Professional. Next Tech Solutions has a 97% client retention rate, 0 debt, 18 months of operating expenses in reserve, and a waiting list for our services. The competition is struggling to match our innovation rate. Each metric was a nail in the coffin of their assumptions. I wasn't just successful, I was dominantly successful in a competitive industry. But the family group chat, Mom said suddenly, her voice confused and hurt. When you mentioned expanding your business, we thought, Michael said it was another scheme. The family group chat, the digital record of their dismissal and mockery. I felt a familiar anger rising as I remembered their responses to my carefully worded mentions of business growth. You called my business expansion plans schemes, I said, looking directly at Michael. You warned Mom and Dad not to lend me money for what you assumed were delusions. Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. I didn't know, you never explained that it was actually successful. I tried to share my achievements many times over the years, I replied. Every attempt was dismissed, minimized, or ignored, so I stopped trying. It was a devastating indictment delivered in the calmest possible tone. I wasn't angry. I was stating facts about years of systematic dismissal. Cousin Jennifer, who'd spent the evening treating me like a cautionary tale about life choices, looked stricken. Emma, I had no idea. When I offered to put in a good word for you at my company, you offered to help me get an entry-level position at a firm where I probably earn more in a month than their CEO makes in a year, I said gently. It was well-intentioned, but it showed how completely you misunderstood my situation. Dad found his voice again, though it carried a tremor I'd never heard before. Emma, why didn't you correct us? Why let us think you were struggling? It was the question I'd been dreading because it required me to explain years of accumulated hurt without sounding vindictive. Because every time I tried to share my success, you found ways to diminish it, I said. When I mentioned landing major clients, you'd change the subject to Michael's latest promotion. When I talked about business growth, you'd offer unsolicited advice about finding stable employment. Eventually, I realized you preferred the narrative of Emma the disappointment to the reality of Emma the success. The words hung in the air like an accusation none of them could deny. They'd created a family mythology where I was the cautionary tale, and they'd been so invested in that story that they'd refused to see evidence contradicting it. Mom's eyes filled with tears. We never meant to make you feel dismissed, but you did, I said simply. For 5 years, you've treated me like a failure while I built something extraordinary. You've offered pity instead of respect, advice instead of admiration, and concern instead of celebration. The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock marking time that couldn't be recovered. The evidence parade began with David pulling up the Nextech Solutions website on his phone, passing it around the room like a courtroom exhibit. The professionally designed homepage featured client testimonials, case studies, and my professional photograph alongside my biography as founder and CEO. Richardson Manufacturing, Dad read aloud from the client list, his voice uncertain. Aren't they one of the largest employers in the state? Emma's automation system increased their operational efficiency by 43%, David confirmed. They're saving over $600,000 annually in labor costs alone. I watched my family process this information, saw them struggling to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the business leader described on the screen. The testimonials were glowing, clients praising my strategic vision, innovative solutions, and exceptional results. Sarah scrolled through the case studies with her lawyer's attention to detail. These are Fortune 500 companies, she said slowly. TechFlow Industries, Morrison Logistics, Hartford Financial, 47 major clients total, I confirmed. We're currently running at capacity with a 6-month waiting list for new implementations. Michael grabbed the phone next, his competitive instincts demanding verification. He pulled up business news articles, searching for any mention of Nextech Solutions or E.R. Matthews. What he found was a trail of legitimate business coverage spanning 3 years. Business Journal named you Entrepreneur of the Year, he read with obvious disbelief. Connecticut Technology Council Innovation Award. Hartford Chamber of Commerce Rising Business Leader. He looked up at me with something approaching awe. Emma, you've won major industry awards. Each accolade was another crack in their carefully constructed image of me as the family underachiever. These weren't participation trophies or minor recognitions. They were prestigious honors that acknowledged genuine accomplishment. The awards are nice, I said modestly, but the real validation comes from client results and employee satisfaction. David beamed with obvious pride in his CEO. Emma has the highest employee retention rate in the industry. People don't leave Nextech Solutions because she creates an environment where innovation thrives. Uncle Robert, still struggling to accept the fundamental shift in family dynamics, demanded financial proof. Awards and testimonials are one thing, but what about actual financial documentation? Revenue claims are easy to make. It was a reasonable request delivered with unreasonable skepticism. He was still looking for evidence that my success was exaggerated or fraudulent. I pulled out my phone and, after a moment's hesitation, opened my banking app. The screen showed my personal checking account balance, $2.3 million. Below it, my Kiono business account showed $4.7 million. Investment accounts totaling another $28 million were visible with a simple swipe. I passed the phone to Dad without comment. I watched his eyes widen as he processed the numbers, then pass it to Mom, whose sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. "This is real," Mom whispered, staring at the financial summary. "All of this is real." The phone made its way around the room, each family member confronting concrete proof of wealth that exceeded their combined assets. The numbers were undeniable, overwhelming, life-changing levels of financial success. "But how?" Aunt Patricia asked, her voice small with confusion. "How did this happen without anyone knowing?" It was the perfect opening for me to explain the deliberate nature of my deception, the careful construction of a double life that had protected my success from their interference. Because I used a professional alias, I said simply. E.R. Matthews is how I'm known in the business world. It allowed me to build credibility without family complications. Family complications? Sarah repeated. Would you have taken my business seriously if you'd known about it from the beginning? I asked. Or would you have offered unwanted advice, questioned my decisions, and generally treated it like another one of Emma's phases? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. They would have interfered, criticized, and probably undermined my confidence at crucial moments. David retrieved his own phone and pulled up a recent Forbes article featuring emerging tech entrepreneurs. There, in a sidebar titled 30 Under 30 to Watch, was my professional headshot alongside a brief profile highlighting Nextech Solutions' rapid growth and market impact. She's been featured in Forbes twice this year, David said. The business community recognizes what your family somehow missed. The implicit criticism was devastating because it was accurate. The broader business world had acknowledged my achievements while my own family had remained willfully ignorant. Cousin Jennifer looked stricken with embarrassment. Emma, when I offered to help you find a job last year, you meant well, I said diplomatically. But you were offering to help someone who employs 23 people find entry-level work. The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone. They'd been treating a millionaire CEO like an unemployed relative who needed career guidance and financial advice. Michael studied the Forbes article intently, his expression cycling through amazement and what might have been professional envy. It says here that you're projected to reach 100 million valuation within 2 years. Conservative estimate, David replied confidently. Emma's strategic vision typically exceeds projections. The final piece of evidence was almost anticlimactic. I showed them my business cards. Elegant, minimalist designs featuring my CEO title and contact information. The cards they'd never seen because I'd never had reason to share them in a family context. E.R. Matthews, Chief Executive Officer, Dad read aloud. Nextech Solutions. Innovation through integration. It was a simple card that represented years of work, millions in revenue, and success beyond their comprehension. But more than that, it represented the person I'd become while they weren't paying attention. The moment had finally arrived for me to unleash 5 years of accumulated hurt, frustration, and disappointment. The evidence was undeniable. The shock was complete, and my family sat in stunned silence waiting for me to speak. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the peace that comes with finally being able to tell the truth. Do you want to know what the hardest part has been? I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was about to say. It wasn't building the business, managing employees, or competing in a tough market. It was sitting at this table every holiday, listening to you celebrate each other's achievements while treating mine like embarrassing delusions. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member who had contributed to years of systematic dismissal. Michael, remember 3 years ago when I mentioned landing a major manufacturing client? You interrupted to tell everyone about your latest investment portfolio performance. That client was Richardson Manufacturing, a contract worth over $2 million annually. Michael's face flushed as the memory returned with new context. What he'd dismissed as insignificant chatter had actually been news of a business milestone that exceeded his entire year's earnings. Sarah, last Christmas when I said I was expanding operations and might need to travel more for client meetings, you suggested I focus on stability instead of chasing unrealistic dreams. Those client meetings were with Fortune 500 companies who wanted to implement my software solutions. Sarah looked stricken, clearly remembering her well-intentioned but devastating advice about abandoning my unrealistic ambitions. Mom, every time you introduced me to your friends as still trying to figure things out, I was actually figuring out how to scale a multi-million-dollar business. While you worried about my future, I was securing it. Mom's tears flowed freely now, her maternal pride warring with the recognition of how badly she'd misunderstood her daughter's life. And Dad, when you advised me to consider more traditional career paths last Thanksgiving, I had just signed a contract that would generate more revenue in 1 month than most traditional careers produce in a year. Dad's characteristic confidence had crumbled completely. The man who'd always been so certain about success and failure looked lost in the face of his own misjudgment. I turned to Uncle Robert, who'd been the most vocal critic of my unconventional choices. You've spent years warning David, and anyone else who'd listen, about my unreliable business ventures. The business you've been criticizing employs more people than your entire department and generates more annual revenue than your company's total sales. Uncle Robert looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His decades of business experience, which he'd wielded like a weapon against my credibility, suddenly seemed irrelevant compared to my actual results. Aunt Patricia, you've introduced me to successful young people at every family gathering, hoping their conventional achievements might inspire me to get serious about my future. Most of those people earn less in a year than I pay in quarterly taxes. The comparative wealth was devastating because it was so dramatic. I wasn't just successful. I was successful on a scale that made their traditional markers of achievement seem modest. But the worst part, I continued, my voice gaining strength, wasn't the dismissal or the condescension. It was watching you celebrate mediocrity while ignoring excellence. You threw a party when Sarah got promoted to associate. You bragged for months when Michael's division had a good quarter. But when I built a company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, it didn't even register as worth acknowledging. The silence that followed was thick with shame and recognition. They were confronting years of their own behavior, seeing their family dynamics through the lens of someone who'd been systematically undervalued. I tried to share my success with you, I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. Every major milestone, every breakthrough, every achievement, I attempted to include you in my journey. But you'd already decided I was the family failure, and no evidence to the contrary could penetrate that narrative. David shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly moved by the raw emotion in my confession. He'd known about my family's dismissive attitude, but hearing it articulated so completely was obviously painful for him to witness. The family group chat messages were the final straw, I continued. Reading your mockery of my schemes while I was preparing to announce our largest contract ever, it crystallized how completely you'd written me off. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the message thread that had pushed me toward this confrontation. Michael, you used eye-rolling emojis to respond to news of my business expansion. Sarah, you warned our parents not to support my delusions. Dad, you called my achievements schemes. Reading their own words back to them in the new context was brutal but necessary. They needed to confront the casual cruelty of their dismissal. While you were mocking my success in family text messages, Business Journal was preparing to name me Entrepreneur of the Year. While you were warning each other about my unrealistic expectations, Forbes was featuring me as an industry innovator. The this year's juxtaposition was stark and undeniable. Their private ridicule had coincided with public recognition that validated everything they'd chosen to dismiss. So yes, I'm angry, I concluded. Not because you didn't support my business. I never needed your support. I'm angry because you didn't support me. You decided I was a failure and held on to that belief even when reality contradicted it at every turn. The apologies began immediately, overlapping and desperate, each family member rushing to explain away years of dismissive behavior. It was a cacophony of regret, justification, and damage control that felt both overwhelming and deeply unsatisfying. Emma, sweetheart, we had no idea, Mom said through her tears. We thought we were being supportive by not pressuring you about money or career success. We didn't want to add stress to what we assumed was already a difficult situation. It was a well-intentioned explanation that completely missed the point. Their assumption that my situation was difficult had prevented them from seeing evidence that it wasn't. Dad jumped in with his own defense. You have to understand, honey. We've seen so many young people struggle with unrealistic business expectations. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment by encouraging more traditional paths. Protecting me from disappointment while I was achieving unprecedented success. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Michael's apology carried the competitive edge that defined most of his interactions. I mean, you have to admit, Em, the way you presented things made it sound small scale. If you'd been more direct about the numbers, about the scope of what you were building. He was trying to shift responsibility onto me for not correcting their assumptions forcefully enough, as if the burden of proof had been mine to overcome their prejudices. More direct? I repeated quietly. Michael, I told you I was landing major clients. I mentioned revenue growth, Employee hiring? Industry recognition? How much more direct should I have been? Sarah, with her lawyer's instinct for finding technical justifications, attempted a different approach. But Emma, using a professional, alias made it impossible for us to research your success independently. If we'd known about E.R. Matthews, we could have looked up your achievements. It was a revealing comment that exposed their fundamental misunderstanding of family dynamics. The idea that they needed to independently verify my claims rather than simply believing me spoke volumes about their lack of trust and respect. You shouldn't have needed to research my life, I said. You should have listened when I tried to share it with you. Uncle Robert, clearly uncomfortable with his diminished authority in the family hierarchy, attempted to maintain some semblance of his advisory role. Well, the important thing now is moving forward constructively. Emma, you'll need to consider how this level of success affects your tax situation, your estate planning. Even in his apology, he couldn't resist offering unsolicited financial advice to someone whose net worth exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. David cleared his throat diplomatically. Actually, Emma has an excellent financial advisory team. Her tax and estate planning have been professionally managed since year 2 of operations. Of course I did. I'd been managing wealth responsibly while they'd been assuming I needed guidance on basic financial literacy. Aunt Patricia tried a different approach, focusing on family unity and healing. The past is the past. What matters is that we know the truth now, and we can start treating Emma with the respect she deserves. But respect that had to be earned through financial revelation wasn't really respect at all. It was recognition of my bank account, not acknowledgement of me as a person. That's the problem, I said quietly. Your respect is conditional on my success. For 5 years you treated me with condescension and pity because you thought I was failing. Now you want to treat me with admiration because you know I'm succeeding, but I'm the same person I was this morning. The observation hit them like a physical blow because it was undeniably true. Their attitude toward me had shifted completely, based solely on new information about my financial status, not any change in my character or worthiness as a family member. Cousin Jennifer looked genuinely stricken with remorse. Emma, I feel terrible about all the job opportunities I offered you. All those times I tried to help you network with people who were probably less successful than you already were. Her embarrassment was palpable, but it highlighted another troubling aspect of their behavior. Their help had always been based on assumptions of my inadequacy rather than understanding of my actual situation. The networking wasn't the problem, I said gently. The problem was the assumption that I needed saving from my own life choices. Mom reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to touch mine. How do we fix this, Emma? How do we make up for years of not seeing you clearly? It was the question I'd been dreading because I wasn't sure there was a good answer. The damage had been done over years of accumulated dismissal. Trust and respect, once broken, couldn't be repaired with simple apologies. I don't know if you can, I admitted. This isn't about money or business success. It's about being seen and valued by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. The room fell silent as they absorbed the devastating truth. They'd failed at the most basic requirement of family, accepting and supporting each other regardless of external circumstances. We do love you unconditionally, Dad said desperately. No, I replied softly. You loved your idea of me, the struggling daughter who needed guidance, who provided a cautionary tale to make your own conventional successes seem more impressive. You've never known the real me well enough to love her unconditionally. It was the harshest truth of all, and I could see it land with crushing force across their faces. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my adult life, requiring me to establish boundaries that would fundamentally alter our family dynamic. I'd spent years accepting their condescension and dismissal, but the revelation of my success had created an opportunity to demand the respect I'd always deserved. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was about to say, it has to be on completely different terms. I pulled out a sheet of paper I'd prepared weeks ago, anticipating this moment. The document outlined my expectations for future family interactions, written with the same clarity and precision I used for business contracts. First, there will be no more unsolicited career advice. I've proven my ability to make successful professional decisions. Your guidance is neither needed nor welcome unless specifically requested. Uncle Robert opened his mouth to object, then closed it again as he realized his decades of business experience carried no weight compared to my actual results. Second, family gatherings will no longer feature competitive discussions of achievements and salaries. We'll interact as family members, not as professional rivals keeping score. This boundary struck at the heart of our holiday traditions, the annual ritual of comparing successes that had always left me marginalized. Third, my business decisions and financial choices are not topics for family discussion or group chat commentary. Next Tech Solutions is my company, and I'll share information about it only when and how I choose. Michael looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing this as a direct reference to his mocking responses to my business updates. Fourth, introductions to your friends and colleagues will accurately represent my professional status. I'm not still figuring things out or trying different things. I'm the CEO of a successful technology company. Mom nodded quickly, her embarrassment obvious as she remembered years of minimizing my achievements to social acquaintances. Fifth, any future family financial discussions will acknowledge the reality of our respective situations. I will not accept lectures about financial responsibility from people with significantly less wealth and business experience. This boundary was particularly harsh but necessary. Their assumption that I needed financial guidance had been one of the most galling aspects of their condescension. And finally, I continued, my voice growing firmer, respect for my choices and achievements cannot be contingent on external validation. You shouldn't need Forbes articles or revenue numbers to treat me with basic dignity. I set the document on the coffee table where everyone could see it. These aren't negotiable points for discussion. They're requirements for maintaining a relationship with me. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition that I was serious about enforcing these boundaries. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a carefully considered ultimatum. Dad cleared his throat uncertainly. Emma, don't you think some of these expectations are a bit harsh? Harsh, I repeated. For 5 years you've treated me with condescension, offered unwanted advice, and dismissed my achievements. I'm asking for the basic respect that should have been automatic from day one. Sarah, with her legal training, recognized the finality in my tone. What if we can't adjust to these new boundaries? What if old habits persist? Then our relationship will be limited to holiday cards and occasional texts, I said simply. I won't subject myself to ongoing disrespect, regardless of family obligations. The threat wasn't delivered with anger. It was stated as a simple business decision. I'd learned to protect my time and energy from people who didn't value them. And family wasn't exempt from that policy. Aunt Patricia looked stricken. But Emma, families work through their problems together. You can't just impose conditions on relationships. I've been working through problems alone for 5 years while you all remained convinced I was the problem, I replied. These boundaries ensure we can have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than your assumptions about my inadequacy. David, who'd remained diplomatically silent throughout most of the evening, finally spoke up. For what it's worth, these seem like reasonable expectations for any professional relationship, let alone a family one. His validation carried weight because it came from someone with no family baggage, someone who'd only ever known me as a successful CEO worthy of respect. Mom reached for the document, reading through my requirements with obvious distress. These make it sound like you don't trust us to change, like you expect us to keep treating you badly. I don't trust you to change, I admitted. Trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, not through promises made during emotional conversations. It was a harsh assessment, but our history provided ample evidence for skepticism about their ability to alter established patterns. So, what happens now? Michael asked, his competitive instincts clearly struggling with his new position in our family hierarchy. Now you decide whether you can accept me as I actually am, rather than trying to change me into who you think I should be, I said. And I decide whether your future behavior demonstrates the respect these boundaries require. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was ending on my terms. I'm going to drive David back to his hotel. You all have some thinking to do. As I gathered my coat, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and liberation. I'd finally told my family exactly who I was and what I expected from them. Whether they could rise to meet those expectations remained to be seen. The drive to David's hotel passed in contemplative silence, both of us processing the emotional intensity of the evening's revelations. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of the downtown Marriott, David turned to face me with an expression of genuine admiration mixed with concern. "That was incredibly brave," he said simply. "I've seen you handle hostile client meetings and navigate complex negotiations. But tonight was different. Tonight was personal." I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the weight of 5 years of hidden frustration finally released. I'm not sure brave is the right word. Maybe desperate. I couldn't pretend anymore. "How do you feel?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Relieved, terrified, angry, hopeful, sometimes all at once. I laughed, but it sounded hollow even to me. I just fundamentally altered every relationship that matters to me. That's either liberation or destruction, and I won't know which for months. David nodded thoughtfully. "For what it's worth, I think you handled it perfectly. You presented facts, set clear boundaries, and gave them a path forward that requires genuine change rather than empty promises." "Thank you for tonight," I said. "I know this wasn't what you signed up for when you agreed to join us for dinner." "Are you kidding?" David grinned. "I got to watch my brilliant CEO finally receive the recognition she deserves from the people who should have been celebrating her all along. It was an honor to witness." After he left, I sat alone in my car outside his hotel, watching the city lights blur through tears I hadn't expected. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the uncertainty. I'd burned bridges tonight, not intentionally, but inevitably. Some family relationships might survive the new honesty, but others might not. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout. The drive home. Mom's desperate attempts at damage control. "Emma, please call me. We need to talk about tonight." Sarah's lawyer-like precision. "I want to understand your boundaries better. Can we schedule a conversation?" Michael's competitive confusion. "I still can't believe you've been this successful without anyone knowing." I turned off my phone without responding. They'd had 5 years to show interest in my actual life. One evening of revelations didn't create an obligation for immediate reconciliation. The following weeks brought a steady stream of family outreach that ranged from genuine remorse to defensive justification. Dad sent a handwritten letter, actual paper and ink, apologizing for dismissing my achievements and asking for guidance on how to be a better father to the daughter he'd apparently never really known. Uncle Robert's response was predictably tone-deaf. He left a voicemail offering to connect me with his financial advisor, apparently still unable to process that my wealth management needs exceeded his comprehension. Some people, I realized, were fundamentally incapable of seeing past their own assumptions. Aunt Patricia organized a family dinner specifically to properly celebrate Emma's success, which missed the point so completely it was almost comical. I didn't need belated celebration. I needed authentic relationships that weren't contingent on external achievements. The most painful response came from Sarah, who sent a detailed email analyzing our family dynamics with clinical detachment. She acknowledged the validity of my complaints, while simultaneously explaining why their behavior had been understandable given the available information. It read like a legal brief defending the indefensible, but there were positive developments. 2. Mom enrolled in a communications workshop focused on active listening and supportive relationships. She sent me articles she'd found about entrepreneurship and innovation, clearly trying to understand the world I'd been building while she wasn't paying attention. Michael surprised me by researching Next-Tech solutions extensively and sending thoughtful questions about my business strategy. His competitive nature hadn't disappeared, but it was channeling into genuine curiosity rather than dismissive skepticism. David and I continued working together as if nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The weight of maintaining my double life had lifted, replaced by the possibility of authentic relationships built on truth rather than carefully managed perceptions. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I received a thank you card that brought me to tears. It was from Jennifer, my cousin who'd spent years offering me career advice and networking opportunities. The message was simple: "Thank you for showing me that success comes in many forms and that assumptions can blind us to extraordinary people in our own families." It was the first acknowledgement that my revelation had taught them something valuable about themselves, not just about me. The most significant change was internal. I no longer felt the exhausting burden of hiding my achievements or downplaying my success. When business publications called for interviews, I answered honestly. When industry organizations invited me to speak at conferences, I accepted without worrying about family discovery. I'd spent years protecting my family from the reality of my success. Now I was protecting my success from the limitations of their understanding. The boundaries I'd established weren't punishment. They were preservation. They created space for genuine relationships to develop while preventing the casual dismissal that had defined our interactions for too long. Not everyone would adapt. Some family members would remain trapped in their original perceptions, unable to see past their own assumptions. But others were already demonstrating the respect and curiosity that authentic relationships required. For the first time in 5 years, I felt hopeful about the possibility of being fully known and genuinely valued by the people who'd raised me. 1 year later, I stood in the same kitchen where I'd once been dismissed as the family failure, but everything had fundamentally changed. The house looked the same. White exterior, black shutters, familiar colonial architecture, but the energy inside was completely different. This year's Thanksgiving invitation had come with a remarkable addition. We would be honored if E.R. Matthews, CEO of Nextech Solutions, would join us for our family celebration. Mom's attempt at humor showed how much she'd grown in understanding the duality of my identity. The annual family newsletter, which I dreaded for years, now featured a full-page spread about my business achievements, complete with quotes from industry publications and a professional photograph from my recent Forbes cover story. My section was no longer buried on page 3 with apologetic language. It led the publication with obvious pride. David joined us again this year, but his role had evolved from secret co-conspirator to honored family friend. The dynamics were entirely different. Instead of condescending questions about his career, family members asked thoughtful inquiries about our business partnership and the technology industry's future. Emma's company just signed its largest contract ever, Mom announced proudly during dinner, her voice carrying the same enthusiasm she'd once reserved for Michael's achievements. $53 million over 3 years with Morrison International. The casual mention of a $53 million contract still felt surreal, but it represented the new normal of family conversations that acknowledged my actual professional reality rather than fictional struggles. Michael had perhaps changed the most dramatically. His competitive nature hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into genuine admiration and frequent requests for business advice. I'm thinking about leaving the investment firm to start my own practice. Could we talk about entrepreneurship? Challenges when you have time? The role reversal was striking. My brother, who'd once dismissed my business ventures as schemes, was now seeking my guidance on launching his own company. Sarah had embraced her mistake with characteristic thoroughness, becoming something of a family advocate for recognizing unconventional success paths. She'd started mentoring young lawyers interested in non-traditional career trajectories, crediting our Thanksgiving confrontation with opening her eyes to assumption-based blindness. I tell them about my sister, she said during dessert, the one I thought was struggling while she was actually building an empire. It's a humbling reminder that success doesn't always look like what we expect. Dad had perhaps the most touching transformation. He'd spent months researching my industry, reading every article about Nextech Solutions, and learning the language of automation technology. His questions were informed and respectful, demonstrating genuine effort to understand the world I'd built. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, during a moment when we found ourselves alone in his study. "Not because of the money or the recognition, but because you had the courage to build something meaningful despite our failure to support you." It was the apology I'd needed to hear. Acknowledgement not just of my success, but of their role in making my journey unnecessarily difficult. The extended family had adapted with varying degrees of success. Uncle Robert still occasionally slipped into advisory mode before catching himself and apologizing. Aunt Patricia had become my most enthusiastic champion, probably overcompensating for years of dismissal with excessive praise that was well-intentioned if sometimes overwhelming. Cousin Jennifer's transformation was perhaps the most genuine. She'd taken a hard look at her own assumption-making tendencies and made significant changes in how she interacted with people whose lives didn't fit conventional patterns. The family photo from this year's gathering told the story of our evolution. Instead of being positioned in the background as the disappointing daughter, I stood confidently in the center, surrounded by family members who finally saw me clearly. My posture was different, no longer defensive or apologetic, but relaxed and assured. But the most significant change wasn't in how they treated me. It was in how I treated myself. For 5 years, I'd allowed their dismissal to create internal doubt about my worth and achievements. Their respect hadn't validated my success. It had simply removed an obstacle to my own self-appreciation. I no longer needed their recognition to feel accomplished, but having it created space for authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than hidden resentment. Next Tech Solutions had continued thriving throughout the family drama. We'd expanded to 47 employees, opened a second office in Boston, and achieved the $100 million valuation that Forbes had predicted. But more importantly, I'd created a work environment where innovation flourished and people felt valued for their contributions. The business success was gratifying, but the personal growth was transformative. I'd learned to advocate for myself, to demand the respect I deserved, and to protect my achievements from people who couldn't recognize their value. As the evening wound down and family members prepared to leave, I reflected on the journey from last year's explosive revelation to this year's comfortable celebration. Not everyone had made the transition successfully. Some relationships remained strained by their inability to adapt to new realities, but enough had changed to create hope for genuine family connections built on truth rather than comfortable fictions. Same time next year? Mom asked as she hugged me goodbye, her embrace carrying none of the condescending pity that had characterized previous farewells. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, and for the first time in years, I actually meant it. The drive home was peaceful, filled with gratitude for the courage to demand authenticity in my most important relationships. I'd risked everything to be seen and known by my family. And while the journey had been painful, the destination was worth every difficult conversation. I was finally, completely, unapologetically myself, successful, ambitious, accomplished, and proud. And my family, at long last, was proud of me too.